Welcome back to Seek Strength and welcome back to the University of Sikistan, where for the first time in I think about a year and a half we're doing a paper review where we look at a paper, break it down, talk about the results. And today's paper is on static stretching. Now, static stretching is a pretty interesting topic. It's gotten a lot of flack over recent years, and obviously with the expanse of mobility routines and mobility experts kind of inserting themselves in their own segment in the fitness industry. And I think for a lot of cases, rightly so, a lot of them are very good at their job. However, one thing that does seem to have gotten a lot of flack is static stretching. Now, routinely static stretching is seen as a way of, increasing range of motion, but it's often associated with reducing power output in intermittent studies, and other studies seem to show that either makes no difference or sometimes it shows that it makes some performance benefit. Now, we've touched on some of the issues with some of these studies before, but today, in this particular study, they're actually showing a benefit with some caveat.
Yeah, I think one of the main reasons people get kind of mixed up or lost in the weeds on the static stretching stuff is they'll basically derive results that they think are applicable to them from a very specific study design. So might be counter movement jump, it might be sprint performance. They might get someone to hold a 45-second long hamstring stretch, get them to sprint within a minute, and then they have some obvious downturn in power because of that, or decrease in power because of that. But this study is actually pretty interesting.
So this study is coming at us from the University of Athens, and it's a study done on 16 elite male gymnasts. And the purpose of this study was to compare two different styles of static stretching. One was a continuous bout of static stretching, and the other was a repeated bout of static stretching. So one bout of 90 seconds, or a group also did 3 30-second stretches with 30 seconds rest in between each of those 30-second stretches. Now, the entire group did everything. However, the control in this group was the opposite leg of those athletes, which is a little bit of a... We'll get to that later, but it is certainly a noteworthy point. Darren's not a fan of that section of it. However, the study then is using counter movement jump as a test, and it's the single leg counter movement jump done on a force plate, and then the time of flight is used as analysis for their results. So they recorded the testing done after certain intervals after the stretching was done, and then depending on different days, depending on what kind of stretching they were doing that day, was it the continuous bout stretching or the intermittent bout stretching, they tested these in immediately after, 1 minute after, and then following 10-minute bouts after the stretching. And then they looked at the results to see if there was any difference on the counter movement jump and range of motion.
Yeah, so to kick off into the results for the counter movement jump, there is a significant combination factor involving which leg was used, how long you stretched it for, and the time after stretching. So basically, whichever stretching condition you were in, and then how far away from that stretching condition you were. Using intermediate stretching methods led to steady increase in jump height from the 2nd to the 8th minute after stretching. So not the 90-second continuous hold, but those intermediate, slightly shorter static stretch holds did see an increase in counter movement jump height. On the other hand, using continuous stretching immediately lowered jump performance, but it bounced back above the starting point after about 6 minutes. So this idea of jumping back above the starting point is very, very common in all kind of sport and exercise science studies. You get a learning effect. So in this case, you're bringing in a group of athletes or people who are training. They're not going to be doing counter movement jumps every day, but we're all well aware of how to do a counter movement jump. So all of these athletes will have dipped down and jumped up as high as they possibly can at some point, but you're getting some familiarization. So as Owen goes from having done no counter movement jumps that day to doing 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, it's expected that those values will increase. Interestingly enough, when we do have the long hold static stretch group, they did gradually decrease until about, there was a gradual decrease until about 6 minutes after the static stretch. So important notes here as well on that. hip and knee movement range. So range of motion, the standard thing we're trying to alter when we're doing static stretching is obviously the range of motion. Knee and hip range of motion in the control group remained steady during both testing methods. So it's interesting, the actual counter movement test itself had no effect on the counter movement jumps, on the knee and hip range of motion. In the stretched leg, there was a significant change in hip and knee movement. So that's obviously important. If we were doing this study and there was no change in range of motion, having done our static stretches, we'd probably need to look at the testing methods and the overall methods of the study and say, okay, we understand that static stretching changes range of motion, be that temporary or otherwise. If we're not getting some sort of change in range of motion from our stretching group, there could be something wrong. So it's important that box is ticked. After intermittent and continuous stretching, hip movement increased by what they're saying 2.9 and 3.6 degrees respectively. They are very small amounts, but as we've talked about probably 100 times on this channel in the paper reviews, we just need to look at whether that is significant or not. That's the main thing we're really looking at here, if it is significant or not. Finally then, and this is a kind of important piece of the results, margin for error was quite small and variability between the measurements was very low across all three measures. So it appears as though they did actually have quite a good degree of control over the subjects, and obviously their testing methods were well controlled. And now we're going to talk about those methods themselves a small bit later.
So static stretching is something that's quite interesting in regards to why would you be doing static stretching, what are your needs for static stretching. But the interesting thing from this study was essentially that the intermittent bout improved their counter movement jump when it came to the use of intermittent stretching versus static stretching. On top of that, then there was the interesting aspect that the static stretching versus intermediate stretching essentially produced about the same levels of increase in range of motion, but further more to that is the fact that the stretching actually did increase the range of motion. There's kind of this idea that, stretching or mobility is something that is pointless because it doesn't return to normal. And I think what a lot of people encounter very, very frequently when it comes to mobility work is that they'll do a little bit of mobility and they'll increase their range of motion, and then they'll come back to training 2 days later or something like that and do the same movement, but their range of motion has, as far as they can perceive, returned to basically the same baseline of what they had before they did the stretching. They're kind of confused, and then we get this idea that stretching doesn't do anything, but we would never do that, for example, with a different skill. We wouldn't do that with aerobic capacity. You wouldn't, say, get into a condition where you can run a 5-minute mile, not trained for a period of time, a couple of weeks even with aerobic capacity, come back and test your 5-minute mile and see that it's gotten a little bit slower, and you wouldn't go, well, running doesn't work.
Yeah, and I think that is the perception people have to get their head around, is like long-term changes in range of motion are very, very different from what we see in most study groups or most kind of studies on static stretching, studies on dynamic stretching. I know there's a lot of debate in the exercise science world and the muscle physiology world over what's happening when we do observe long-term changes. Are we getting muscle cells adding on to the end or the distal end of those muscles? Are we getting some sort of change in muscle composition where the actual muscle is getting longer? But as an athlete or as a coach, that's really not important to you. And that's not to say you shouldn't be looking into research. The research and the science is important. But what's really important is that static stretching changes range of motion. Although it doesn't change it permanently, it does get you the results you need. And so if you're a weightlifting coach and you have somebody in front of you who has poor lockout overhead in the jerk, and you say, okay, their shoulders might be internally rotated, their lats badly need to be stretched, I think we've gotten somewhat mixed up in the weeds here, or a population of people have. They say, oh, I'm not going to use static stretching to increase that range of motion now because this is the wrong time and they'll be a less powerful athlete because of that. This is the right time. Before training, when we're trying to hit certain positions, is the correct time to be doing these interventions. In terms of the longer term change the range of motion, I think that that has a slightly more application in kind of postural stuff, health and wellness stuff. So if you have somebody who's working at a desk and they get shortening of those internal rotators, then we need to probably look at what's going to give us more bang for our buck in terms of long-term permanent changes of range of motion. And to be honest, in my opinion, currently, I think the biggest thing that would get our bang for our buck for us there will be less emphasis on the antagonist in those cases. So if you do get that poor overhead range of motion because their shoulders are rotated forward, we should probably be looking at deactivation of the pecs, better posture overall over the course of 24 hours of the day rather than what just happens before training.
I think if you had to explain what happened in the study, I think it's relatively straightforward. But if you look at an isometric, it's basically the same thing as a static stretch. A long-term static stretch, 90 seconds, is an isometric hold. And we know isometrics are very fatiguing. And it's one of the things they kind of came to the conclusion to when isometrics first appeared in the scene kind of in the 50s and 60s. And it made an appearance in weightlifting where the idea was that if you could do a static hold with a certain amount of weight, then you could apply that same amount of force that you were holding potentially to maybe the second pull of a clean. But they quickly found that it didn't translate over, and it seemed to be quite intense in terms of wear and tear or perceived pain on joints. And static stretching is essentially just a very long muscular contraction. Now we kind of forget that, and you think of stretching as something that's slightly different, but when you boils right down to it, it's a very long stretch. We're fatiguing the muscle. So if you hold something for long enough, while it's an unweighted stretch in these examples, if you do it for long enough, you're applying a different kind of fatigue, a longer time under tension. If you go to do a different activity soon after, you're just fatiguing the muscle, and of course your performance is going to be a little bit worse. The intermittent bout stretching, though, is slightly different than that, and it seems to be something that's following a trend in the industry that seems to be working with a lot of the better prehab, rehab specialists, range of motion specialists, is the idea of PNF, or proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation, which is very, very straightforward to use. You do a stretch, and then you relax, you push in the opposite direction, and you stretch a little bit further again. And it seems to be very, very beneficial increasing the range of motion, at least in the short term, if you do it frequently enough for a joint. And if you look at then this new range of motion, you're getting the same new range of motion from either the static stretching or from the intermittent bout stretching, but what you're not getting is the prolonged fatigue from the static stretching. And then on top of that, then we know that an elastic muscle or pre-stretch muscle can often produce more force. And then we get this idea that if something can stretch a little bit further and we can do a little bit faster and a little bit freer, hopefully if you can do that faster, you might get an improvement in your jumping, which they did in this case. Now, does that mean that you should go do a load of intermittent bout stretches before you're jumping?
Probably not.
Yeah.
I think people get used to, maybe it's particularly bad in teams, people who play team sports growing up, where they're used to the idea of you warm up, you stretch, then you do your specific warm up, and that's what you do. Mm-hmm. Or you cool down in a similar method, but probably in reverse. I don't think stretching needs to be there unless it's to achieve a certain goal of altering range of motion in some way. I really don't think stretching doesn't have to be a mainstay. It's a really good tool, but it doesn't have to be there in every warm up. One noteworthy point from the study that I do think is a bit of it's something that should be discussed, is the use of non-control leg and control leg.
Yeah.
I'd love to know how those legs were selected. I assume they're going to say randomized, but I guarantee you're going to have some people who'll say like, oh, I have a bit of an ache in this hamstring. Mm-hmm. Can I just stretch on the other leg? You know, that's always how these things tend to happen. Or this is my dominant leg, this is my kicking leg. I don't want to be stretching the shit out of this hamstring. I'll do the non-dominant leg today, you know. I just feel like knowing the scale of lack of symmetry across athletes, I really think that is a kind of a big no-no. Also the fact that counter movement jumps are a full whole body exercise. It's not just your quads, your hamstrings and your glutes. Mm-hmm. You're going to then stretch one part of your body and expect to infer results from that, and then not stretch another side of your body and infer results from that. I think it would have been a lot better if you had done matched randomized pairs and you had just gotten them to do counter movement jumps on both legs, or even just do them bipedal, and then have a control group that's an actual control group.
On the subject of should you be doing those kind of intermittent bout stretching before performance, is this something that's useful for your kind of power training, or is it something you should be doing for your particular sessions? Is I think what's best at the moment, or it seems to be a more effective way of doing it, is very specific mobility drills that you need to improve on. So if you're a weightlifter with tight ankles, you address your tight ankles, but you don't, for example, work a lot of time on your hips. You don't work a lot of time on your thoracic. If it doesn't particularly need it, you spend the bulk of this specific warming up, or the specific mobilizing, maybe is a better word, or specific increasing range of motion on the specific areas you need that are problem areas. You might need to do some maintenance, and you give yourself a kind of tiered value of each of those. So you go, my ankles, I'm at the worst. My front rack is generally very good once I warm it up a little bit. So you go 10 minutes on my ankles, 2 or 3 minutes on my front rack. And then we get into the specific warm-ups with the clean and jerk, for example. So we start with our ankles, we do our lats, and then we move to the clean and jerk, and we might do something like the barbell complex. If you've been to one of our seminars, or if you've been to any of our training camps, you'll know that every session starts with basically a generalized barbell warm-up into a specific barbell warm-up. So it's something like rows, squats, and presses, and then maybe into muscle cleans, strict press, press from the split, something like that, where you are actively doing a warm-up, which is the generalized and the specific warm-up. The actual warming up is left to a skill that's applicable to the skill you're doing, and you're not really doing this kind of whole body static stretching on everything every time you train, I think.
Yeah, if there's studies you'd like us to look into, or even a kind of area of study you'd like us to do a video on, we'd really appreciate it if you pop it down below. We'll leave a link to this study in the description of this video. If you have any questions on training programs, coaching, consultation, Seeka sleep supplements, any of that, email us, seekastrength@gmail.com, and we'll get back to you.
Now, if you want an upper body as jacked as a gymnast, you don't necessarily need to go do gymnastics. You could just run our bench press program. It starts off with 2 sessions per week, moves to 3 sessions per week as benching off does respond to a little bit higher volume, and then it peaks after 10 weeks for a new 1RM bench press. You can get it at seekastrength.com, and the link will be left below.
Stay flexy.